Hi everyone. Do you guys know the former world champion Tigran Petrosian? He was world champion from 1963 till 1969. And did you know he learned how to play chess late? He was 12 years old when he learned how to play the game. Okay, all these other great grandmasters throughout history, you always hear them learning chess at age 4 or 5 or 6. But Petrosian didn't learn until he was 12. And I found his probably one of the earliest recorded Petrosian games. So I'm going to show you a game that he played when he was 13 years old. Just been playing chess for about a year when he played this game. And it was a simultaneous exhibition, and Petrosian had the white pieces, and the player who was giving the simul was Flohr, F-L-O-H-R, who was one of the top 10 players in the world in the 1930s. So let's see how this game went. Okay, d4, knight f6, c4, e5. So e5 here, this is an unusual opening. It's called the Budapest gambit. And we're going to learn a little bit about this opening in the course of this game. So here, almost everybody takes the pawn as Petrosian does, and then knight to g4, attacks that e5 pawn. So Petrosian just says, I'm playing e4, you can have the pawn back. I don't want it. I'm just going to put my pawns in the center of the board and get some central dominance in this game. But I wanted to mention how most people play this today. So e4 is not at all common. Instead, what white tends to do is defend the pawn on e5, at least for a while. White may either keep the gambited pawn, or he may give it back after forcing black to make some kind of concession. And so the normal way to protect it is bishop to f4, and then black attacks it again, white defends it again. And by the way, you might wonder, can you move these minor pieces out in either order to defend e5? The answer is no, not really. So bishop to f4 is more accurate, because if you play knight to f3 first to defend the pawn, then this allows black to play the move bishop to c5, attacking f2, and the natural way to defend it is e3, and that blocks your bishop in. So that bishop is not coming to f4 in that line. So you play your bishop to f4 first, and then knight to c6, knight f3. And now the most accurate move for black is to play bishop to b4 check. You might put this queen here to attack that pawn a third time, but you don't want to block in that bishop. So you play bishop to b4 check, and now white is at a crossroads. There are a couple of ways he can block this check. Doesn't want to use these minor pieces, which are defending the e5 pawn. So it's this knight's job to block the check. And let's look at both ways of doing it. So you could play knight bd2. Okay, and now black can attack that pawn with the queen. a3. Okay, you're going to try to force black to give up the bishop pair here. Now, black doesn't have to respond to a3. He can play one of his knights takes e5. So pop quiz. Why can he do that? Can't white just take the bishop on b4? What happens if a takes b4? Yeah, hopefully you saw the correct answer. If a takes b4, black responds knight to d3 checkmate. Checkmate. Okay, so white takes the knight, and black takes back with his other knight, and pop quiz number 2. Why can't white play a takes b4 in this position? Okay, because of knight to d3 checkmate. Okay, so white plays e3, stops the mate. Then the bishop takes the knight, and the queen takes back, and some normal developing moves. And so the way white has played this, he's given the pawn back, but he has the bishop pair, so that's a slight advantage to white. Now there's another way to block that check from the bishop on b4. You could play knight to c3, and the point of that move is to keep the d file open. You want this queen to be able to come to d5 if that pawn on e5 gets hit. So you're going to save your pawn. Now, if you do that, black is normally going to say, okay, I'm going to take that knight and completely shatter your queenside pawns here. And then I'm going to attack your pawn. And you can play queen to d5 if you want to, and you've saved your pawn, but at what cost? I mean, these pawns are terrible over here. All these pawns are terrible. So at what cost have you saved your pawn? Nevertheless, that's a valid way of playing. Okay, so back to the game. So Petrosian plays e4 here, and he says, go ahead, take the pawn on e5. I don't care, I'm giving it back. But Black doesn't take it. He says, okay, you attacked my knight, I'm just going to defend with h5. Now, I'll point out that h5 is a weakening move. Okay, every time you push a pawn forward, you're leaving squares behind that are becoming weaker that pawn can no longer defend. So that h-pawn cannot defend these two squares anymore, so they're both weaker than they used to be. So if white puts a piece on g5, for example, black will never be able to push the pawn to h6 and drive it away. This square on g6 used to be defended twice, now it's just defended once. So the king side's becoming weaker when you do that. Most players don't play h5 nowadays in this line. They just go ahead and take the pawn. Now, white is going to do pretty well, though, in that case by playing f4 and just expanding and gaining space here. The knight falls back to c6. Bishop to e3 is a good move. It's a prophylactic move. It stops black from putting this bishop on a nice square on c5. And now most players will play bishop to b4 check here and try to disrupt white a little bit. But I wanted to mention an inferior plan. What if black decides, hey, I want to put a bishop on c5 anyway, so I'm going to play knight to a6 and support that c5 square. Not such a good idea, but let's go down this rabbit hole. This is very fascinating. A good way to play against that as white is a3, and your point is, okay, I'm keeping knights off of that square. I'm going to play b4, threaten b5. Maybe those knights aren't situated in the best possible way there. You're going to lose time with a possible fork. Okay, and then bishop c5 as planned, queen to d2 to protect the bishop. Knight to a5 is a very interesting move. It's headed for the b3 square, forking the rook and the queen. So what does white do? Well, he protects the b3 square and keeps an eye on his bishop. And then queen to f6 attacks the queen and tries to remove the defender of b3 and e3. Well, white just blocks and expands in the center. And now another interesting move, queen to b6. I love that maneuver. The queen goes like this. And that queen is now pressuring both e3 and b3. So what does white do about this? Well, now he's forced to exchange the bishops. And black has a lot of pieces pointed at b3 here, but white has everything under control. He plays b4, forking the knights. And now black can try knight to e4. Gets one of the knights to safety while attacking the queen. But then queen to f3, and by the way, there's also pressure right here on f2. There's a queen and a knight pointed at f2, so white has to do something about that. So he moves his queen to safety and protects the f2 square. But now black jumps in with his other knight, knight to b3, and white cannot afford to take that knight with his queen. He has to keep protection of f2. So he has to move his rook. Okay, but now the very interesting move, knight b to c5. Look, that pawn is pinned. That rook just left the back rank. That knight is vulnerable. So takes. Okay, and then knight to d2 moves that knight to safety and puts pressure on the e4 knight. And now the knight on c5 is under attack. So black trades like that and then plays knight to e6. But then c5 is a nice move, expanding, hitting the queen. Queen goes to c6, and then f5. And just look at this position. Black tried really hard to get some action there and get that bishop out to c5, but it didn't work. White repelled him, and white has a ton of space here. White is just killing in this position. You often hear people say one side of the board has more space than the other. I've never really heard a definition of exactly what space is, so I'm going to propose one. This is my own personal definition. I've never heard anybody say this before, but maybe it is the typical definition. I don't know. My definition of space is count how many squares that you have from your back rank up until your wall of pawns, like this. Look at all of those squares behind your pawns. And there's no pawn on the d file, so maybe we'll also count all the squares until we hit a black pawn, right there. So all those squares I highlighted, I'm going to count that as the space, white's space. That's the space on white's side of the board. That's a lot of space. Look at the space on black's side of the board. The squares behind his wall of pawns in addition to those squares. That's a lot less space. I didn't mean to draw that arrow, but that was a lot less space. Okay, so white is really killing it in that line. So anyway, back to the game. So after e4 threatening the knight, black decides to just protect the knight. And now white plays a pretty inexplicable move. He plays h3, and then black taps him on the shoulder and says, are you sure you want to make that move? My knight, it was headed for e5 anyway. Wasn't I going to take that pawn on e5 anyway? Is that a useful move? You don't want to take that back? Okay, so white probably would have done better with a developing move like that, or maybe that. So I think this is just a wasted move. h3, black takes the pawn and says thank you very much. And white plays bishop to e3, which is good. Like we saw in that other line, it prevents the bishop from coming to c5. So knight b, c6, knight c3. Bishop b4 is the most active post for that bishop, pinning that knight. Queen to d2, that's a pretty strange looking move. I wouldn't have considered such a move. Yeah, you probably don't want your pawns to be ruined here, so you want your queen to defend your knight. But I think queen to c2 is more natural, defending the e-pawn. If you put your queen on d2, then you're just saying, okay, I want to put all my important pieces, my best pieces, on the diagonal that you just placed your bishop on. Looks strange to me. However, I think there is a point to that move. We're going to take a look at that in a minute. Black proceeded with d6. White was probably expecting either d6 or castles there. Those are the two natural moves in the position. And then white pushes his pawn to f4, gaining more space, gaining central control, driving the knight away. But it is sort of a concession to push your pawn 2 squares. Every time you push your pawns, remember about all the squares you left behind. Okay, that diagonal here looks weaker now to me. That square looks pretty weak. Also, that e4 pawn is a little weaker than it could have been because white's never going to be able to push f3 to defend that pawn. Okay, nevertheless, it's probably a fine move, and black has to move the knight. I will mention, if black attempts not to move the knight and throws in this Zwischenzug queen to h4 check, then he's just blundered a piece because white can play bishop to f2, blocking the check, attacking the queen, and both the queen and the knight are hanging. So black is going to lose a piece. And now you finally see why Petrosian put his queen on d2. That is defending the f-pawn so you don't have queen takes f4 here. So maybe that's why he did that, because of this particular line. But black doesn't go for that, doesn't lose a piece, he moves the knight. But he moves the knight to the wrong square. He plays knight to g6. Why are you putting your knight on g6? Where's that knight going? There? 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 That's not a great complex of squares you have under control. A much better square for that knight is on d7, which looks strange. Why are you retreating your knight, blocking your bishop? Well, it's because it's going to the c5 square. And from c5, it can pressure that e-pawn. Remember that e-pawn is a little bit weaker than it could have been once that f4 pawn moved. So I think that knight belonged on c5. But anyway, he moves it back to g6. Knight to f3 comes. Queen e7. That attacks the e4 pawn, so bishop to d3 defends it. And now a very interesting move, f5. Probably a bad move, but it's interesting. Piques my interest because of tactics. That pawn is only defended once, and it's under attack by these two pieces. So can white win a pawn here? Well, white does take the pawn, which probably is not the best move. I'm going to go back and show you the best move in a minute. But why doesn't that win a pawn? Well, there's some action here on the e file. If you remove your e-pawn from that file, then you've just pinned your own bishop. And that's what happened in the game. Black took that pawn on f4, and now his knight has come to life. Okay, that knight is pressuring the bishop on d3. It's pressuring g2. It's a much better knight now. So white should not have allowed that sequence of moves. Instead, white should have said, hey, you pushed your pawn 2 squares forward and you left behind some weak squares, particularly the g5 square. Why don't I hop my knight into that g5 square? Now that is an excellent move, knight to g5. Not only are you putting your knight on a permanent outpost, look at those 2 pawns. They passed up their opportunity of ever driving that knight away. That's a great outpost for the knight, but also the knight is defending e4, dual purpose move. That knight has a lot of great squares it's looking at, and look how close it is to that black king. Oh, the program won't let me draw an arrow here to the black king, but it's pretty close. Okay, so that's a good strong knight there. That would have been a better move than what was played in the game. E takes f5 allowed this knight to come to life. So white castles long here and gets his bishop out of the pin. So now he is threatening the knight on f4. And black takes the opportunity of destroying the pawn structure here because white can't take back with the queen because his bishop would hang. So white breaks apart his pawns, and then black takes that bishop, trades off his knight. And now black passes up an opportunity of playing very actively and getting a good game. Instead, black plays the passive move bishop to d7, getting ready to castle queenside. I think a much better move here is bishop takes f5. The surprising move, again, that piques my interest. I like tactics. Doesn't look like you can take that pawn because the queen had that guarded, but not really. The queen was overworked. Do you know what an overworked piece is? That queen is the definition of an overworked piece. It's defending 2 things, that pawn and that bishop. It can't defend both. Black takes the pawn, or black should have taken the pawn, because then if white takes the bishop, black gets this bishop with check and attacks the c3 pawn, and let's look at a sample line of how this might have gone for black. White would protect the pawn with his king, of course, and now rook to f8 is a good move to disrupt that queen. That queen is on a nice square there. It's preventing black from castling queenside, and black just gave up the h-pawn. So white says, thank you, I'll take that with check, but then the king steps to d7. He says, I don't need to castle. d7 is a safe enough square for my king. I just needed to connect my rooks. I just need that rook into the game. So king to d7 is fine, but then queen to g4 check. Queen can block that. Okay, you don't want to move that king. You don't want to move it back to the back rank and block in that rook you just freed. And it can't really come to the center of the board on e7. You got rook to e1 there. So you have to block with the queen. And then white takes another pawn here with check, but black just blocks it with his rook and says, okay, that's fine with me. Let's look at the pawns. Whose do you like better, mine or yours? Well, white says, I got 5 pawns and you've got 4. But black says, you don't have 5 pawns, you have 5 targets. Those pawns are awful. Every one is a target. All of those pawns are possibly targets that can be attacked and won. So what about black's pawns? Black's pawns are nice. Look at that. Perfect pawn island. No weak pawns, no targets. Play might have proceeded queen to g4 to save the queen, perhaps. And if that happened, you got even worse pawns here. Look at that. Okay, rook to e8, centralizing the rook. I would much rather be black in that position. Maybe it's not winning, but still, I'd rather fight against targets. Okay, so that is probably the more active way black should have played. He should have played bishop takes f5 there, taking advantage of the overworked queen, but instead he plays bishop to d7. And now white makes an inaccuracy. He plays the move rook h e1, which seems good. You're putting the rook on a central open file right where the king and queen are. Looks good to me. But unfortunately, that gives black the possibility of castling his king to safety, which he does in the game. He castles his king to safety. He's not worried about any discoveries on his queen. He can handle them. However, he castled the wrong way. White is going to take advantage of that. He should have castled kingside. That is much better. And you'll see why in just a minute. But I did mention this rook move to e1 was an inaccuracy. What should white have done? Well, he should have played bishop to g5 and attacked the queen, and then the queen would have to move aside. Then he can play his rook to e1 with check, and there's no safe way to block the check, and this forces the king to move to f8, and then g4, making the pawns really nice there on the king side, and white's doing really well due to black's misplaced king. So that was more accurate, but it didn't happen. So rook went here, and then black castled the wrong way. So pop quiz. Why is that the wrong way to castle? What's white's move here? Okay, you probably see the move Petrosian played, bishop to g5, skewering the queen and the rook. So black has to move the queen aside, white takes the rook and wins the exchange, as we say. And then plays g4 and solidifies his pawns. And black has absolutely no compensation for this lost exchange, so this should be a pretty easy win for white. Let's see how it finishes. Black plays knight a5, threatening the c4 pawn. And now, when you're up material, Paul Morphy has taught us trade queens. If you can force a trade of queens or a trade of material, especially queens, then go for it when you're up material. So what's a good way for white to trade queens here? Yeah, I bet you are looking at the same move Petrosian played, queen to d5. So that forks the knight and the queen, and it forces an exchange here. Okay, and then rook to f8 is played. Rook d7, putting the rook on the 7th rank, attacking that g7 pawn. Black pushes the pawn, white takes it, and then black takes on g4 and attacks the knight. But white says, I can leave that knight there for a move, I'm going to push my pawn. Okay, you have to stop that pawn. You don't have time to take the knight, I'll take the rook and queen. So that forces rook to g8. And now I think white makes another inaccuracy, although it doesn't really matter, he's winning anyway. He plays his rook on e7 to f7, and his intention is to play that rook to f8 with check and either win that rook or force an exchange and queen the pawn. So that's the threat. But I think there's a better way to get a rook to f8. White probably should have gotten this other rook into the game. It hasn't moved in a while. In fact, I think it only moved once in the whole game when white castled. And it's sitting there. It should get into the game. Paul Morphy taught us that too. Put all your pieces into the action. So how do we get that rook to the f8 square? Well, we begin by saving our knight, centralizing the knight to d4, and that opens up the f file. And then our next two moves could be rook to f1 and rook to f8. That's probably much more accurate and would have ended the game sooner. But instead, rook to f7 was played. And that actually allows black somewhat of a defense here. Bishop to e8. And now, when white plays rook to f8, it's not with check because the bishop is blocking the check, and that allows black to take the pawn. Now, that does seem to give up the bishop, but don't forget, white has his knight hanging. So white loses the knight. But that's okay, white is still up the exchange. I would point out, if you took away this h3 pawn, then I'm not even sure white's winning. I think black can probably hold that draw if that h pawn weren't there. But this is a nice pawn to have. It's called an outside passed pawn. It's on the edge of the board, and the black king is far away from it. And so white's going to use it to distract black's pieces, and black has to stop this pawn from queening. Okay, so let's see how the game finished. We'll just go through this last part quickly. Okay, rook to f4 allows the pawn to come forward one more square at will. c6, c4 to protect. King comes over. King to b2 is a strange move. I'd point out that I would have considered c5, trying to attack that pawn and destabilize that knight on e5. And that does give up protection of d5, but black can't take it because of this sequence. You take this pawn with check, king captures to protect the knight, then check, king attacks the rook, but then we attack the pinned knight and we win it on the next move. Okay, so that probably would have been faster to play c5 there, but he brings the king up, king to b6, pawns get traded, and then a bunch of pointless moves, and white slowly improves. I'll point out that this is a strange move, rook to g3. I don't really understand that move. What about rook to h3? Do you guys know the famous chess player who said rooks belong behind passed pawns? That was Tarrasch. Dr. Sigbert Tarrasch said rooks belong behind passed pawns. So that rook's going to protect that pawn forever as it pushes forward to its promotion square. But he plays rook to g3, pretty strange, a6. Maybe black should have played rook to b1 here just to remind white, hey, don't forget, put your rook behind the passed pawn, because if you don't do it, I'm going to get my rook over there. Okay, but anyway, the game proceeds like this, and they make a bunch of silly moves. Black should resign. Gets a little spite check in there, attacks a pawn and says, hey, I'm going to take that a2 pawn with check. And white says, I don't care. I'm pushing my pawn. I'm going to queen. And black says, okay, I was just kidding. I resign. All right, so 13-year-old Petrosian wins this game against the legendary player Floor. Although we will forgive him because it was a simultaneous exhibition, and that means black was playing a lot of players at the same time and didn't have time to analyze in depth. Okay, so I hope you enjoyed the game. I sure did. I learned something about the Budapest opening. Thanks for watching.